And so the challenge that we have requires some sort of collective organization. There can't just be an individual response to these things, because it's one thing to say I as an individual can resist some of the tendencies of social media. I don't think as a culture the tendencies are resistible.
Yes.
On the culture-wide level, the tendencies I think are inexorable.
Should we ban smartphones and video games? My name is Matthew Lee Anderson, and you are listening to another episode of Mere Fidelity, the podcast where we think together about the Word of God in the world we live in. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Lexham Press. You can get all of the Lexham Press Mere Fidelity books of the month at lexhampress.com/Mere Fidelity, including, for 48 more hours, maybe 72 more hours, The Giver of Life, The Biblical Doctrine of the Holy Spirit and Salvation, J.V. Fesco. This is a pricey book, so you can get 40% off on that at lexhampress.com/Mere Fidelity. Strong endorsement to do so. And thanks as well to the merry band of patron supporters for keeping us going. I feel very neglectful of you all, and I'm very grateful that so many of you have continued to support us through the summer, and we do want to get back to giving you due attention here now that we're re-entering the ordinary schedules of the fall. So you can join the merry band at merefidelity.com or drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. All right. There's all the opening details. Very delighted to have Andy Crouch back with us. I'm tempted to say the Mere Fidelity technology correspondent. Andy is a partner for theology and culture at Praxis. He's the author of a number of books, including The Life We're Looking For, Reclaiming Relationship in a Technological World with his daughter Amy, all sorts of books. We've had him on to talk about several of his books, I think, at this point. Andy, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Glad to report back in from the frontiers of technology.
Yeah, I was trying to decide between describing you as our technology correspondent or our expert on the principalities and powers.
Same job.
Same job. That's right. We're not going to ask you how demonic technology is this time, though it's always a hot topic.
I might.
But this is a great show. It's not often that we've done episodes that are inaugurated by tweets, but it turns out that the platform
in these latter days
come to some good. Yeah, that's right. So, Andy, you tweeted, I'm going to remind you of something you wrote on the platform a while ago. You tweeted, I'd summarize a lot of the emerging trends this way. Social media is pretty terrible for girls, but not so terrible for their prospects as young women. Video games are not so terrible for boys, but pretty terrible for their prospects as young men. And then porn a fortiori. So the first question is, unpack this for us. Set this out. What's up with these emerging trends with social media and video games with the youths?
That's right. Well, the first thing is that we actually have data to talk about that is fairly reliable as social science data goes, which there's a big asterisk on that, or multiple asterisks maybe on that. So I wrote this book, The TechWise Family, in 2017 because I was just myself, as all of us are in this era, trying to make sense of what's a good path for technology in all kinds of places, including the home. And the number one question I would be asked, when I would speak about the book in 1819 BC, basically, before COVID, was, what's the data? What do the data show? And I found this a very annoying question because for a couple of reasons. One is, these usually very well-intentioned parents. And it's such an American question to ask, well, what do the experts tell us is happening? The most important data is the data you have from your own child. Tell me, you have way more data about your own child than anyone else does, and that's what matters the most for your own decision. So you don't need some, controlled experiment out on a population N of 5 million to tell you what's happening. But the other thing I would say is, it's too soon. We don't have evidence yet. It takes a really long time to collect anything like reliable data about social effects. Well, it's now 7 years after I wrote the book, and 5 or 6 years after I was fielding all those questions about the data, and now we actually are getting more and more data that has the kind of reliability that comes from time, from people having time to kind of spool up survey design, from these questions about, for example, social media use getting incorporated into just general social survey type measurements and so forth. And I was reflecting, as I wrote that tweet, Matt, that I was reflecting on, Jonathan Haidt and collaborators' work that has been collating all this data. And it really is converging on a very consistent story, which is, and this was the first thing I said in the tweet, social media is pretty terrible for girls. There's a really strong correlation between the number of hours a girl spends on social media in a week, say, and depression. By the way, Haidt about a year ago kind of summarized this, and he made the really interesting point that it's not like poison, as in you take a dose and then you immediately feel really terrible or something terrible happens. So some of the studies that are done that are allegedly show there's no effect look at it just over a single week. And in a single week, it probably doesn't make any difference, like so many things don't. But the longer term studies that look at use over time show this very strong effect. So it really is pretty hard to dispute that the mental and emotional health of adolescents around the world in many, many different cultures, actually, though I'm most conversant with the data from, the Anglophone world, the US and UK, that girls really suffer when they kind of get caught up in this kind of system. And, of course, Meta, once known as Facebook, themselves had this data from their own internal studies. So this really should not be a surprise, right? The really complicating thing is that even social media proper doesn't seem to have the same effect on boys. And then more generally, all these hockey stick effects that we're seeing in girls' mental health troubles, where the hockey stick is, suddenly trending up in the last 5+ years, it's a much more muted effect for boys. So that's the first thing I was thinking about. Mm-hmm. Then I was thinking about, on the whole, and considering the background population level phenomena, which is everybody's getting more depressed and anxious across all age groups, at least in the United States. But given the background trends, young women are actually not doing so badly. So young women are now the majority of college students in the United States. They're the majority of elite college students. They're the majority of professional students. They are excelling in the workplace now that barriers to women for participation in professions or whatever have dropped. They're actually doing pretty well. And so now ask, how are young men doing? And it's not a zero-sum game. Young men do poorly at the expense of young women. At least I don't think so. But young men are doing terribly. I mean, they are not seeking out challenging employment. They're not even seeking out just good, solid jobs like plumbing that we all really want there to be another generation of plumbers for very practical reasons, speaking as a homeowner. Young men are not seeking out the trades. The trends aren't like catastrophic, and they aren't as hockey stick-like as for girls, as near as I can tell, but they're still very notable. So then I started thinking, well, what if it's because the things boys get hooked on through digital media in adolescence are not terrible in the moment or in the short run? That is, you're playing a bunch of video games with your friends. I mean, that's pretty fun for a boy. And these games are quite social, as any parent of boys knows, both if they're played together, like in the same room on a game console, but also the online games. You got your headphones on, you're talking to your friends, some of them some of them maybe made through the platform. So you feel kind of connected, you're on a mission together, you're doing the thing, and this is a little speculative, but I think one of the fundamental kind of masculine motivations, especially sort of unfiltered in a way in childhood and early adolescence in boys, is just to show mastery in front of other boys. Like you want to show that you have figured out how to do something. If it's a Rubik's Cube and you're a nerd, that will work. If it's basketball, that'll work. Like you want to show that you've mastered something and get other boys to recognize it. And they're getting to do that. And then you add in porn, and it could be the case that in the short run, porn is a good way of kind of satisfying sexual urges for men. It doesn't seem to be so much for women, but for men, it seems to kind of work. So in the short run, your mental health might not really diminish that much. Now, I think all of us have seen that boys have fairly compulsive behaviors when it comes to video games, let alone porn. And that troubles families and parents. But if you were just measuring, like, how are they doing? If you ask them on the kind of things we ask on surveys, they might do fine. The problem is, sorry, Matt, I feel like I'm going on really long with this technology.
No, this is great.
But so one more kind of paragraph here. The problem is the things that social media leverages for girls that make it so terrible, and maybe we can unpack that more for men trying to figure out why it's terrible for girls. We'll see how we do. It's about positioning yourself socially to have influence, basically. And this turns out, in my opinion and observation, to be kind of generally a kind of fundamental motivation for women, is to influence in a social setting. It's not so much about mastery of the world demonstrated. It's kind of more mastery of the relational world, or knowing how to operate within a relational world with all the feedback that we're meant to get from each other. And girls are very motivated to figure that out. Now, that gets very toxic in the way social media channels it, but the skills that it's developing are extremely translatable to the world of the professions, to the world of kind of high achievement, even just kind of ordinary life in our very information and relationally flowing kind of organizational context that we now live in college. And so what my kind of working theory here is that it's terrible when it's kind of infected with the immaturity of adolescence, but it matures into a kind of relational fluency that's actually transferable to real world success on the terms of postmodern capitalism. But for boys, that mastery that you achieved in the video game has, unless you go to fly drones for the Air Force, which you can do, it has very few real world correlates. And it has substituted for developing any real world correlates. In other words, you have no idea what to do with a wrench. You have no idea what to do with an actual truck. You have no idea what to do on an actual football field, for that matter, if you're only playing FIFA football. And so you've spent the formative years of your life developing a simulation of skill that's very satisfying to exercise, but does not translate into any efficacy into the world that you as a young man are trying to enter. So this is my theory. And then I'll just say one more thing, which is, in one sense you can say, so the young women are okay. The problem is most of the young women want to find a young man, just statistically speaking, and form a life partnership with him. And what do you do when all the young men have had all their development attenuated by these simulations, not least their sexual development? And you're stuck. So it's bad for young women too in the long run. Sorry, that was really long, but that's how I'm thinking about it.
That's a lot. That's so good. Andy.
No, that's super helpful. And even on the porn double, I mean, leaving aside the obvious big moral issue in terms of just the isolating and underdeveloping any social and emotional skills that you need to actually relate to, connect,
yes.
Find, attract,
yes.
and communicate in any way that would generate any sort of the sort of relationship that would be the beginnings of a marital bond.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
It's the exact inverse. Even
exactly.
more than video games, which at least you can be friends with people and still have some amount of social fun and so on. I mean, I'm terrible at video games, but other people, from what I've heard, still do. But that inverse relationship. So that's very helpful. It's very helpful to think that through in terms of how that shrinks the capacity.
You said something interesting. You qualified that, Derek, in an interesting way. You said leaving aside the moral kind of considerations. And I think I know what you mean, but I almost wonder if that's an unnecessary apology for what morality actually is. Because I think morality actually is a claim about what forms you in the long run into a person who can live even the life you yourself want, let alone the life your community wants for you or whatever. And so I just think we don't have to morality is a ideally time-tested set of judgments about what makes for someone who can form the kind of life the kind of life we should have. So, it's funny that we feel like we need to say, just on a practical level. Well, morality is practical, it turns out.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's just there's that level of the big, bright, shiny red line of the Lord has said, don't objectify. Right. And then it turns out doing that consistently for years and years and years and years tends to shrink you.
Yes, right.
As a functional human in a lot of relational ways. And so in the measurable ways.
On this theme, Derek, I mean, setting the moral considerations aside, I mean, Andy, as you were talking about the porn dimension specifically, you actually had a line that I thought, oh man, if people took that out of context, it'd be hilarious, right? Because you said something like porn is actually pretty good, could be pretty good in the short term for satisfying young men's sort of sexual appetites. Right. And I thought, oh man, if anyone were to sort of like want to cancel Andy Crouch, they could take that little bit.
Well.
And it happened here first.
And do that. It happened here first. It wouldn't be the first. But I actually think there's something about the way in which, I mean, I'm reflecting about my own writings about pornography, which I've had several at this point in different contexts, and sort of the dimensions that I have missed about this. And one of the things that I find really gripping about your presentation and your thoughts on this is just trying to weave together the short-term benefits with the long-term damages, and how things that are short-term very satisfying and rewarding are in fact long-term very degenerative and not conducive to our happiness and harmony. And there's something about the way in which this is not really on the theme, but there's something I think about the way in which evangelicals, including me, have talked about porn and the prohibitions and tried to persuade young men to not engage in it, that has missed this social ecology and has missed these finer grained dimensions of the lack of formation that's going on. That's my, and maybe this is personal. Maybe evangelicals did do better at it, and it was my failure. And I'm actually really open to that. But I think there's something about the social ecology of these practices and the ways in which they're forming us that is very helpful to expand our moral horizons in the ways in which you're talking about, to situate these technologies not just in the kind of immediate short term. What's it doing now?
Oh,
but
totally.
What is it doing to us over the next 20, 30 years?
And, and I think the reason that thought comes naturally to me is that I have already really decided that all addiction is just a species of what the Bible calls idolatry. And one of my fundamental convictions about idols is they work at first. I don't think things become idols without delivering initially on the promise. Even the fruit in the garden, which is the primordial idol, in a sense, does deliver knowledge of good and evil immediately as advertised. They immediately have a new sense of dimensions of shame, responsibility, guilt, etc. that they didn't have before. I think that one's a little tricky, but we look at the ancient Near Eastern figurines that we've dug up in archaeology that we also read about in the Old Testament, little statues of bulls, fertility statues, and so forth, and especially the bull. Like, why would you worship this thing? Well, I think the reason you would is somebody worshipped it at some point when they really needed a crop or some fruitfulness of the ground, and it happened. And you're like, oh, we found the trick. Let's worship it again. And I just don't think you would. I don't think primitive people were somehow so cognitively different from us that they, like we can't imagine worshiping that thing. But we absolutely devote ourselves now to things that in the long run are not going to work, but that in the short run have delivered. And to me, that's the pattern of idols. So it would make all the sense in the world to me that the really powerful idols actually deliver at the beginning reasonably well. And I think social media does that too for girls, in that inchoate, disorienting stage of middle school where you're suddenly aware of social dynamics and of competition and conflict and all these things that suddenly come to the fore. To have an app that channels that, gives you some control over it, gives you some feedback that you don't know how to get otherwise, like it kind of works for you, at the beginning. So I just think that's idols.
One thing I wonder about with social media, first of all, there's a variety of social media. We might think about the differences between something like Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, Instagram, Tumblr, Discord. All of these have their different dynamics. And it also seems to me that one of the developments of the social media age has been a more general feminization of social contexts. So whereas previously the internet was a far more male space, I mean, the old slogan, there are no women on the internet, or there are no girls on the internet, the idea that there is a certain social cachet that women have within mixed settings that was not operative in a context where you're just operating anonymously for the most, or pseudonymously, and in terms of speech.
The days of Usenet or whatever. Yeah, it was a lot of guys.
And also when you introduce these vast sort of planes of discourse, whereas formerly you'd have these smaller niches, these fora or blogs and things like that. Now you have these vast open plains, as it were, where people are herding into tribes, and there's a certain liveness to speech that comes as a result of the immediacy of discourse. Whereas if you're reading a book, that word has been written many years ago for the most part, and so there's not a sense of liveness to it. But on something like Twitter, every element of speech there, every statement is a speech act. And so people are wondering, what's this person signaling? How are they associating? Is this a statement of alignment? Whatever it is. And what we've seen, I think, in the last 10 years particularly, has been a shift, culture-wide, towards a society that has more feminine norms of discourse. If you think back to the earlier period of the internet, it was the place where new atheism was all the rage. And it was a very male form of debate, belligerent, argumentative discourse, really built along an Oxbridge mode, with the key leaders being men like Dawkins, Hitchens, Sam Harris, Dennett. And what happened was a very significant and marked shift with the rise of social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter, as they went mainstream, and the movement in the Tumblrification of discourse that Catherine D and others have described, to a feminization and to social justice discourse, which is very much focused not upon this sort of old vibe of the new atheist discourse, which was very much about truth doesn't care about your feelings, hard science, belligerent argument. It became very much sensitivity, recognition of the need for equality, inclusion. It's very much a shift to the culture of the old fan fiction groups, which were really mainstreamed in many ways by Tumblr and its discourse about various franchises and discourse about Harry Potter and things like that, and all the morals surrounding them. And so I think there's been this more general shift that's happened in the culture as a result of the internet. So it's not as if women are participating in this realm of social media and then finding it fits very well to the wider culture of the university, the workplace. The culture of the university and the workplace has been Tumblrified, has been brought into this culture that's been formed online. The internet now is the wider culture. And so it seems to me that that shift is an important one for the dynamic between the sexes in ways that men would not have struggled in quite the same way in the world of 2005. But this shift, I think, is an important one that has shaped the culture more broadly.
Yeah, I was feeling a little, I was going to object in a way that I'm not sure girls use social media in the ways that you're describing. And I think we shouldn't overestimate, and this is based on very secondhand understanding, because my own daughter, for example, is now in her 20s and completely off social media and has been for years. But I think we shouldn't overestimate the amount to which social media for girls is even public. It's very much about a kind of too wide community of reference and, like a school, say, where you really should be known by your group of friends and not care about other kids is how I think you should live. But it's about kind of expanding your community, but it's not about entering this kind of world of discourse like the New Atheists or something like that. I don't think hardly any 13-year-olds are doing that. But what you're saying,
I think the key shift is that identity has become the big political thing. And so the internet is a place of self-representation.
Where you
And
can kind
that
of perform
became an
that,
obsession, particularly the norms around that
I see.
on Tumblr. And then they became mainstreamed through Facebook and then Twitter. And that becomes more general discourse. So politics becomes about very much projecting your identity. There's a certain therapeutic shift within the wider discourse.
Alistair, I think what you're talking about applies more to millennials, elder millennials and younger millennials, et cetera, rather than like the Gen Z, the junior high to high school Gen Z Zoomer kids that I think we initially were talking. I think I'm not disputing the social trends, but in terms of like how it functions psychologically,
what I'm talking about is the experience of young men and young women. Whereas there's another conversation about boys and girls.
Right. So what I'm hearing is like there were two things going on. One was kind of the sudden explosion of the usage of these various things for boys and girls, adolescents. But then, like when they hit adulthood, it's almost like they're meeting a moving target in terms of what the relational norms are, and in that sense, it's a world where boys turning into men, maybe you're saying, are even less equipped, like even more disoriented and have our time, like finding a way to operate in this new world of the new adult world that didn't exist, that has also had its own story of how social media has shaped it. That's interesting. I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah, just to put a point in for Alistair's thesis, Caitlin Tiffany has a book, Everything I Need I Get From You, How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It, right? Yeah. In which I think this is part of Alistair's story, the identification of groupies on the internet and their ability to follow, say, one direction, and the development of Tumblr. And in the middle of that process really had pervasive influences on how people identified themselves more broadly in a way. But I think Derek's point is also really salient here, in that there are, in one respect, two different conversations happening, where Alistair is reflecting about the ways in which those transitions that happened in the 2010s really reshaped sort of broader public discourse beyond the internet even. There is still this question about what's happening with young people who are not on Tumblr right now, where young people means the high schoolers, where the nature of the usage of social media seems to have shifted between what's happening on TikTok. There's still fandom that's happening. Obviously, the Swifties are more than enough evidence of the power of fandom. So that hasn't gone away, but there is something that it has become more pervasive, more consuming about these different types of social media that are in your pocket versus what happened on Tumblr. It's been more mainstream, and that seems like it's a slightly different conversation than I think that which Alistair has introduced.
I will say I kind of wonder if we're entering. I mean, this is a bit speculative, and who knows where it's all going. And of course, the most dominant app that exemplifies this could be banned any day almost by almost any American administration or Congress for different reasons. But TikTok, which is like the latest apotheosis of a kind of, I think, unfolding trend, is so much about the algorithm, and the algorithm is so inescapable. I mean, that's the thing that is really, I think, shaping the next generation's experience far more than even Tumblr ever had, because the big shift in all social media is from the chronological to the algorithmic. The chronological being just kind of a in order list of the things the people you follow have said or posted or whatever. The algorithmic is a response to the failure of the chronological, which is you end up wanting to follow too many people. It's a flood. You need a way to sort, and so the algorithm will sort for you. And it almost feels like to me like the algorithm is disrupting the collectivities that formed in the age of the chronological timeline, whether it was the blog roll, to go like deep Gen X here. Or, you alluded to a couple of these, Alistair, like or just the collectivities that could form actually are now broken up by the algorithm, because the algorithm is going to serve you not your next friend in your kind of niche community that cares about a particular fantasy novel series or something. It's going to serve you like the next thing that scratches the itch that's closest to the surface that the algorithm can measure. And it bounces around. It doesn't like embed you in any kind of tribe. It just bounces around from titillating thing to titillating thing, and using that word very broadly for whatever it is that tickles your little, dopamine receptors that the algorithm can detect. So I almost wonder if the next generation there's this even more isolating kind of phenomenon going on, it seems to me.
Well,
I'm speculating.
It even feeds you your next hate read, the next
absolutely.
You click on one tweet, you're like, man, that guy is a dope. Why do I keep seeing his stuff?
Yeah.
Keep getting madder. Why do you keep? And then you click, and there it is, and now you know the next person you don't like. The algorithm knows you don't like.
Can I read my favorite sentence ever about the algorithm? I think I've never encountered a sentence like this. It's by Rebecca Jennings at Vox. When she was writing about TikTok, she wrote this. This is a real sentence in the English language. She proposed that TikTok is, quote, one of the best platforms for questioning people who can allow their algorithm to take them on a journey that could eventually lead them to a more authentic and joyful place. Like as a distillation of what their algorithm
oh my goodness.
could promise them on TikTok, their algorithm is going to lead them to a more authentic and joyful place. And I just think like that's really
that's
a
like
sentence.
the algorithm as like birth doula along with like familiar and all other things.
It'll lead you all
spirit
right.
Guide.
It's going to lead you somewhere.
Hey, now we're back at AI as demons. There we go. Good.
That's right.
I mean, so my daughter is the one who really got me thinking about this, because she has decided she will not use any platform that doesn't have a way to escape the algorithm, which means she's off most of them, both as a poster and as a consumer, if you will, and she has a great line, or a great phrase about this. She says, the algorithm consistently catches you at your worst. It never catches you at your best. It never and that's an unbelievable quote from Rebecca. It's hard to believe someone wrote that and felt like they could just put it out there as a straightforward kind of hope for what could happen for the algorithm. Because all of us know, like, these things do not help us pursue what we ourselves consider makes us happiest. That's amazing.
I do find with algorithms, just the very way that they're designed to make you reactive and to diminish your capacity of response. So I think of the ways that we have the capacity to respond, it has a lot to do with the sort of hiatus between stimulus and what happens next.
Yes.
And so that difference can be time, it can be the emotional space where we don't feel people are squeezing in upon us. It can be the context where we're just in solitude and we can spend time reading alone. It can be that sense of the distance in time that exists between the person who has written and us reading. It can be a host of other things like that. And social media, the pace that it moves, the immediacy of it, the emotional intensity of it, all of these things rob us of that differentiation that enables us to respond rather than react. And so the more that we're bombarded with this sort of material, the more that we become people who are just within this plasma of direct connection with other people and constantly just bouncing off them, rather than actually being able, we have the sort of collective feelings of like panic or collective anxiety or collective anger. There's not the ability to stand back and wrestle with our own selves and actually gain self-mastery. And it seems to me that there's also a technological aspect to the shift from the internet as something that you go on to. You go on to the internet in the 1990s to surf the internet. You call downstairs and who's using the phone? I need to use the internet. And that experience is very different from the experience of the internet being ever present. It's on your body, and you feel almost this phantom connection with your phone, or what we should think about as a mobile device. It's most of the time we're not using it as a phone, but there is this sense of direct connection with this object, and that object connecting me with a world that's ever present. It's always in the background of my consciousness and never far from the surface. And that, it seems to me, is a very significant shift. There's a sense in which every context is now connected to the internet. As a result of the mobile phone, there's not the ability to get distance in the ways that we once could have done. And even when we're in solitude, it's right there.
I'd be curious if there was like a longitudinal study of like big five personality trait kind of over time across a mass culture. If everybody's just trending upwards on neuroticism or something like that, just as at a society-wide level, because you're always potentially always observed.
There is no control group.
Right. Yes. Right.
The Amish. Do the Amish count as a control group? You could get a couple thousand Amish people, right? Who have had limited exposure to the internet.
Could do Lancaster County and Chester County in Pennsylvania and see what you find.
Yeah.
I mean, the control group really would be students. Like I think of a couple of students of mine who have told me that that recently have gone off Instagram or whatever it is, and because they'll ask, hey, where do we have the schedule? And like, oh, well, we posted on this, or, oh, I'm not on that. I'm not on Instagram anymore. That's fine. Okay, well, we do have an email. We do send that out. You just got to get on the list. But the control groups is essentially the hopefully increasingly large portion of the population that opts out, and then you kind of see what happens long term. And I suppose that's where we get to the proposals.
The problem is that's a confounded group, because that's, first of all, it's like 2%, I'm afraid to say, Derek. Maybe it's 5% of your students, but it's like, if it's 2% of the population, I'd be shocked. And of course, the question is, what was it in their environment and makeup that caused them to be willing to swim that much against the tide? I do think, I don't know whether anyone listening to your podcast cares about like practical applications of things.
I was actually going to turn us there, Andy. So
okay.
This is my question. Yeah, go for it.
Well, I think it is kind of incumbent on anyone who's in any kind of leadership, honestly, to provide a non-algorithmically mediated way to participate in the things you do. I mean, so like what you said, Derek, well, I mean, we put it on Instagram, but we have an email. Like, you should, if you run an organization for people of any age, you should have an email. People should not have to sell their data soul to Mark Zuckerberg to find out what's happening in your church. Like, it's just such a simple thing. Give the resistors a way to meaningfully participate in your little small platoon that you're trying to build, because in the long run, they'll be better participants and more fruitful. And you don't want to be aiding and abetting them having to wade through 20 pieces of algorithmic stimulation to find out when Bible study is. So just at a practical level, like, let's make sure we give people a non-reactive, channel to communicate, which are still available to us, at least for now. So let's use them while we have them and build them in a way.
One challenge I think we have there is that it's when a new technology comes along and is adopted almost culture-wide, the things that you could formerly enjoy without that technology increasingly require the use of that technology, even to the point that, I mean, this is particularly an issue for older people who need to use QR codes, who need to have mobile devices that just to do basic functions within society, to travel, to enter particular go to particular events. And you might think also of the way that if a couple of kids in a school get mobile devices, that becomes the ecosystem for their sociality, for the sociality of their group. And if your child is not allowed to get a mobile device, they are squeezed out of something that they'd formerly enjoy without it. And so I think the challenge that we have requires some sort of collective organization. There can't just be an individual response to these things. In part also because it's one thing to say, I as an individual can resist some of the tendencies of social media, I don't think as a culture the tendencies are resistible.
Yes.
On the culture-wide level, the tendencies, I think, are inexorable. And so either you have very strong social-wide resistance and develop structures of coordination against them, or you just have a general tendency that has its effect with the wider population and a few people standing out as hermits or resistors in various forms.
Yeah. Which really gets at my opening question, Alistair, very nicely.
I was wondering if we were going to get to that
And
question.
Andy, I'm intrigued to know your take on this. I mean, you do have the hate proposal to ban cell phones in schools, and I'm just wondering, like, how far would you take that? Like, what sort of policies should pastors or heads of Christian schools? I think we actually probably have a lot of people who listen to this podcast who work in Christian high schools, who have responsibility for these sorts of things. I'm just curious, what sort of ecosystem level shifts could we aim at that would be constructive on some of these problems?
I mean, I have a pretty simple rubric. I really think in any formative community, the digital should be absolutely marginalized. So by formative community, I mean a place where we reasonably expect that one of its principal purposes is to shape human beings into the kinds of persons that we all hope to be. And to me, the three primary formative communities are home, church, and school. I don't mean those in any particular order. So the home is a place where not just children, but everyone, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, are shaped by playing certain roles together that you can't get shaped that way any other way. School is the place where you're inducted into a particular cultural tradition, and if it's a religious school, at the same time into the religious dimension of culture. And then church is where, of course, you meet, God and Christ, but also any religious community. I mean, I would extend this. I think actually probably Muslims and Jews are ahead of us, perhaps. And there's this kind of interesting confounder that just came up recently. You can't study how Jews use cell phones because none of them will carry a cell phone to synagogue. Maybe some Reform Jews do, but like no Jew carries all Christians bring their smartphones to church. Very few Jews do that, take it to synagogue, because violates the Sabbath in the most fundamental way. And so I would say in school, there should be basically nothing digital at the formative end of the work. Now, on the back end, record keeping, finance, of course, you make use of those tools. But in education, in the classroom, in the sports team, zero for everybody, teachers as well. Same for at home.
It's also a good prophylactic against AI encroachment on writing, but
of course. And I don't like the word ban because it sounds like, should we ban video games? I mean, first of all, our society is not going to ban video games. This is a bigger industry than Hollywood. They're not going to get banned. But should they be present in formative environments? No. I don't think it's not even a hard question on the merits of the case. Like there's literally zero evidence that having anything glowing in a school increases educational outcomes for anyone. The OECD studied this this was one of the few pieces of data I could cite back when people were initially asking me that question of data, because the OECD had been studying, and these are all developed economies, so right? They're roughly rich world kind of countries, but they have kind of interestingly different educational systems, and therefore different choices about technology. And what I found is not a strong negative effect on learning, by the way, just null effect. Like it just doesn't matter, except they're incredibly expensive to maintain. And this was before the distraction layer came in of personal devices. So if you're an educator, like I'm at the sort of top level of generality, There is no evidence all those screens in your school are doing anything for the outcomes you care about. And if you're a Christian educator, I guarantee you there is not a shred of evidence that the net effect is beneficial for the outcomes your school allegedly exists to serve. So then the only questions become rhetorical and tactical of how do you persuade the parents, because the reason kids have phones is the reason they're given phones is not to solve kids' problems, it's to solve parents' problems. And you've got to help the parents see that this will actually solve more problems than that the current setting creates more problems than it solves, and help them solve the problems they were trying to solve by giving their kid a phone.
I do wonder when you say that it doesn't help really solve any of the issues that we care about in education. It seems to me that maybe object to that one of the things that people are looking for from these devices, these various forms of technological access, they think this is the world that their kids are going to be entering into. This is their social world. This is the world of work. They're going to, one way or another, be spending much of their life working with AI. They're going to be spending much of their time on social media. They're going to be spending much of their time working with the glowing screens of devices, whatever it is. And if they are not prepared for that world, then they're not prepared for the so-called real world. How can we present an argument that may not be the real world? And if you're preparing your kids for that, you're not preparing them to be true, rising to their full stature as human beings.
Right. So first of all, let me qualify one thing I said. I do think in secondary education, that is high school, there's absolutely a place for the instrumental qualities of computational devices. That is, I talk a lot in my last book, for example, about the difference between devices and instruments. And I define an instrument as a technological thing that is used to deeply extend and form human beings, so like a musical instrument or a scientific instrument. And a lot of scientific instruments, of course, have digital interfaces, and there are screens that go with them. And if your kid is doing a chemistry experiment and the best way to collect the data is with a PC-based or a smartphone-based interface, fine, have those in the chemistry lab. I have no problem with that. I just don't want them substituting for formation, and instruments don't substitute for formation. They actually extend formation. That's what makes them instruments. So to the extent that these devices can be used instrumentally, at the appropriate age, bring them on. Now, I think before secondary school, there's more important things to happen in school than anything a screen can do. But later on, they're great. Now, the question of, hey, look, we're all entering a virtual world. It is the real world for everybody. It's the economy is happening on it. Work is happening on it. I guess I just think it's just not that hard to learn. There's nothing complicated about these things. They're all designed with these incredible affordances to make it very straightforward. This is not like computer literacy of the 1990s where you had to learn like the DOS command line in order to save a file. And by the way, I'd much rather the kids actually learn computer programming. Like, for goodness sakes, learn Python. I would love for high schoolers certainly to be learning that. It's part of learning to think mathematically, actually. But the idea that the sort of social presentation layer of, we use all kinds of tools at Praxis where I work, Asana and Excel and Google everything. And, you can, if you've been educated, seriously educated, you can learn that in an afternoon. Like, it's just not complicated. It's not a thing you have to teach in school. It's training. It's just job training. You'll learn it in your onboarding on day one at the law firm. I just don't buy the idea that there's some set of competencies that we have to disrupt the formation of persons to like channel them into this way of relating that we call the social world. You'll figure out Slack when you're 23 years old and you get put in a workplace that uses it. I promise. And you'll be better at it and use it in a healthier way if you weren't on social media from the day you lied about your age at age 11 and got a Facebook account. So
that's a great word to end on, Andy.
And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go check my Slack messages.
That's right.
For my non-formative workplace.
Exactly. That's exactly right. This has been a very provocative conversation. Thank you, Andy, for your time. We are, if you still have a few more minutes, 3 more minutes, we're going to ask you one more question for our patron supporters. And it's going to be a spicy one. So if you do want to join the merry band and get access to that, you can do so at merefidelity.com. We do hope that this conversation has been constructive and provocative for you and that you have been edified by it. We're grateful for your time and attention. And rate us and review us on iTunes. We love to hear from listeners. Send us a note if you found something that you liked or disagreed with. Drop us a line through merefidelity.com. We do read all of our mail. We are going to be back in the weeks to come with other conversations about the Word of God and the world we live in. Until then, though, this has been Mere Fidelity. All right, Andy. So we started with your very stimulating thoughts about the asymmetries between the genders and how technology relates to those and shapes people differently, men and women differently, or these technologies do at least. We ended with a question about formation and communities and the ways in which communities can help people form well. And I'm just curious about the gender dimensions of those formations. Is there something about, like, how can communities not only just have tech level policies that are general, but is there something that they could be doing for young women specifically and young men specifically that would help them cultivate in the ways that they need to, that would supplant the type of formation that they'd otherwise get from social media and video games? Like, what are the alternate forms, gender-specific forms of formation that communities should be thinking about?
Wow. Amazing question. And so modern that we have to ask it. Like every other culture until now never had to ask, because there are initiation rites built in to every culture, practically speaking, that is pre-modern, that know that girls have to be assisted in managing especially, each transition from boy to man and girl to woman is very fraught with surprise and pain and grief and wonder, and every culture has known we need to help human beings through that in their two kinds of male and female. And we are sitting here like in 3 minutes for the bonus question. Like, so how are we going to do that?
Yeah, you're welcome. I figured I'd throw you a softball.
So, let's just reflect on what we've lost in just how adrift we are in not knowing how to help boys become men and girls become women. And I don't totally know the answer either. And my own children, I have a boy and a girl who are now a young man and a young woman. And wow, I'm amazed at how they've grown up into that, each of them into that reality. And I honestly have no idea what we did, and I don't know how to turn it into a plan. N of 2, so I think I truly believe I'm going to be a little implausible here, Matt, in answer.
That's great.
So I truly believe if we got kids off the screens in the formative years, and I think 0 to 10 matter the most, and into communities where kids were off the screens from 0 to 10. So if you did have home church and school where that was true, and for some people listening to this, that's not totally impossible to imagine. This is going to sound a little weird, but I almost think you could follow their interests. What do the girls want to do? What do they want to do together? And the reality is, and it's so interesting in our world of, in a way, aggressive gender neutrality, and some of it actually I support, not assuming that boys only do one thing and girls only do another. It's still the case when I walk by any elementary school playground, the boys are playing together, and the girls are playing together. Like they socialize separately. And as they come of age, they're still socializing separately, and they've got interests. And the community around them could, I don't mean let the children tell us what they need exactly, but like pay attention to what is motivating to the girls to do and give them a formative pathway to take that to a level of seriousness. Because really what it is to become an adult is to transmute your childhood interests and fantasies and imagination and exploration into kind of a seriousness about it. That's the vision quest idea, right? From many of the native peoples in the Americas, you kind of go off and you find out like, who I've been before am I going to have to be in a new elevated way as an adult? And I think girls and boys will want to pursue different things. They'll be drawn to different things. Not all girls in all the same ways, but enough that you'll be able to like discern. Take them. What kind of trip do you want to go on as girls, led by some of the women in the community, and not just older women, younger women too? And what do the boys want to do for this weekend event that we do for the boys in our ninth grade, say going into ninth grade? I think you would discover like what they actually want formation in. If you had the preparatio of a formative childhood free from the kind of distortion of screens. Does that help?
Yeah.
No, I think that
just helps a lot.
Just adding to that, that's one of the problems with social media, that any other sort of social formation, there's an intergenerational dimension where there's a world that has already been inhabited before us, and it's been inhabited by an older generation, and we're inducted into it with their habits, and they help us. Whereas on social media, it's led by the young to the extent that it is intergenerational. It either flattens out the generations or it gives the young the driving seat. And so the very dynamics of formation are reversed or undermined or absent.
And maybe as just a coda on this, that's so right. And I almost would say it doesn't even really matter what you do. Just go somewhere together where young and older women are with girls who are transitioning into young, adolescence and very young womanhood. Same for the boys and the men. And just do something. I don't even care what it is. Just let them be with you as 25-year-old men, as 55-year-old men, as 80-year-old men. I really believe beautiful things would be happening if we were creating those intergenerational experiences. And I don't know that it would have to have a whole lot of content per se. Just the interaction with the proviso that everyone involved has somehow been detoxified from the digital would be really good.
Yeah. I just say one little coda on that is another coda, just for coda's sake, is,
it's a Tchaikovsky style symphony. It has like 5 endings.
Yeah. We're now in the 5th. One more.
I mean, parenting under the algorithm, you follow one account that's got info on food for one subject or whatever it is, and you get bombarded with not only product placement, much of which I would probably spend I'm so the algorithm knows exactly how to sell me crud that if I had money, just all of it. But in terms of just an entire generation of parents being taught to parent by other parents who are figuring it out, having things forced on them by the algorithm that's almost governed by like, what's this new ritual that we came up with that is the opposite of what our boomer parents did and is going to be just as messed up as, but that whole feedback loop, it's not just detoxing the kids, having them off the screen for 10 years, it's having the parents off the screens for 10 years. And that's extraordinarily difficult because of the project of performative parenting in front of the screen.
Oh man.
Is even the bigger temptation there, I think.
Yeah.
And that's been my line with respect to the humanities. I'm the problem. It's me. With respect to technology, I'm the problem. It's me.
It's me.
Right? Like I have no time, no patience for people in positions of leadership trying to impose norms on the youth that they are not themselves embodying.
Absolutely.
Nothing succeeds when that happens. Andy, for a 7-minute answer with additional codas. That was excellent.
That was great.
Really
Great.
Even more stimulating.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking up such a tough question there at the end. I really appreciate it. And thanks for listening, Merry Band. We're grateful for it. We'll talk with you guys soon.